Welcome to Power, People and Planet. I'm Kumi Naidoo, and I want this podcast to break the definition of who is an activist. We have defined an activist as a person who works full-time for an NGO, trade union, and faith organization, and so on. We have to understand that that's an inadequate definition in this moment of history. Pessimism is a luxury we simply cannot afford. One of the key challenges that we face is that we are called upon to mobilize the largest ever level of popular participation and mobilization. And to do that, we'll need to rethink who is an activist.
Thank you for inviting me to be part of this very thought-provoking podcast. So I'm a proud mother of two lovely children. I had the privilege of being born and raised in my beautiful home country, Syria, to a lovely family, very well-educated parents who not only brought love to the household, but also a very, very rich library of Arabic and English books. They took us around the whole country, so I had the chance to enjoy the richness of the landscape, of the cultural identity, and a very, very deep history of Syria. But against this beautiful backdrop, I also grew navigating two overlapping systems of power. On one side, there is patriarchal social order, very strong norms that seek to limit individuality, especially for women. And on the other side, we had a very authoritarian regime with a Soviet style indoctrination machine that really sought to control every aspect of your life. And these two systems, they really reinforced each other. And they both sought to control your voice, your choices, and even your imagination. But I think I enjoyed pushing against these systems. So I grew up developing a mischievous personality, taking some joy in the kind of daily defiance against these regimes. But I think to me, my most important act of defiance was very much internal. It was in the mind. It was really just preserving my right to think freely, uh, resist the lure of conformity, resist the pressure to fit in, um, and just be myself. And I enjoyed all of that in a way or another. And at the age of 26, I left Syria to pursue an academic career that took me to Sweden, Scotland, and then England, where I live today.
Now, I want to take you back to Syria and ask you about that moment when the revolution takes up after what some people call the Arab Spring. But I've had some friends of mine in the Arab world say to me, we hate this term Arab Spring because it suggests that the fight for justice is a seasonal activity, and rather like to frame it as the resistance to authoritarian rule. And the reality is, a lot of that authoritarian rule was linked to Western governments' strong support for various regimes in the region. Now, the one question that I think will be interesting in the current moment, we're having this conversation just before the climate negotiations in Brazil, in the Amazon, in November. And that is, some people would say that the Assad regime was one of the most brutally repressive regimes for quite a long time. What was it about that moment when in 2010, 2011, when the resistance actually explodes in the way that it does? So some people say, well, there was a whole momentum that started in Tunisia that just covered everybody. But others say that, yes, that was a factor. But another factor was what was happening in Syria that hardly gets reported, which is the fact that Syria had deep seated drought in many parts of the country, and there was migration driven to the cities as a result of the deepening impacts of climate. So, one of the things I just wanted you to reflect on, what's your take on how important the climate pain that people in Syria, particularly in agricultural areas and so on, were feeling, that drove them to the cities. And maybe in that desperation, finally they said, we got to stand up to this brutal regime. Where do you land in terms of where the drivers were? Obviously, both, I would say, were factors. I would just like to get a sense of how that plays in your analysis.
Yeah, so Kumi, the environmental factor was one among many, but it wasn't the decisive factor. So it did lead to a migration from the northeast of Syria, where people relied a lot on rain, to the south, to Daraa, where actually the revolution started. So all of that migration added pressure on resources and everything. But the thing is, I think what the climate change did is that it exposed the regime. It exposed the lack of protection, lacks of policies, lack of alternatives. So when it doesn't rain, people are left to starve. It shouldn't be like this in a state which is used to be rich, right? So if anything, really exposed the fact that the system was not working, and it did, of course, increase the level of grievance and frustration, together with many other factors. People felt that's it, enough is enough. And the nature of the media also changed around that time, and that did help, because that very, very strong ideological apparatus of the regime was suddenly breaking down, because people can hear the message from many other different sources.
Okay, that takes me to the nicely to the next question, because um, you know, when people ask me why is it that people like yourself who've been fighting for decades for human rights, environmental justice, climate justice, and so on, why is it that you're not winning fast enough or big enough? The main answer I give is that I think that the mistake that activism and social change agents have made over a long period of time is that we imagine that the biggest threat we face is the repressive state apparatus, meaning army, police, formal laws, rules, and regulations, and so on. And of course, the repressive state apparatus plays a very massive role in defining the parameters of civic and political life, right? But as has been said by many others over history, that one of the mistakes we've made is actually thinking that our biggest threat is in fact the repressive state apparatus, when actually the biggest control is in fact the ideological state apparatus, which we mean the framework for education, the framework for religion, the funding of arts and culture, and most importantly, the framework for communications and media. So give us a sense of how this played out, how it was before the revolution, and how in the time when people stood up, how the media landscape has changed, and how is it today? How is it changed now in the current situation? So slightly before the media landscape, before the revolution, during and after.
Sure. So I grew up in Syria in the 70s and 80s, and this is the period of Hafiz Assad and that kind of what you described as the ideological apparatus of that repressive regime. It was at its highest. It had many different arms. I'll speak about three of them. One, of course, was education, which you mentioned, and so our life was shaped with the ideology of the Ba'ath Party, Arab National Socialist ideology, uh, through schooling, through the curriculum. There were no such thing as private schools. They're only state schools. And from day one, you're groomed as the sprout of the Ba'ath Party. You had no choice. You were fed into a certain curriculum. But the most important thing was not the content of the curriculum itself, Kumi. There was like a psychological game. I mean, there's like a power game out there. So you often had to learn and memorize things that both you and your teacher and everyone else knew you don't believe in. But the point was to break you and to force you to absorb this knowledge and stand up and
Mhm.
repeat it and sing their song and their slogans, even though knowing you don't believe in it. That's how they demoralize you. And I'll give you one example. All of us had a compulsory course at school. We had to sit the exam for in the baccalaureate called the Arab nationalism. And it was all centered about the ideology of the Ba'ath Party and full of the speeches of Hafiz Assad. And all what we had to do to pass that course is to memorize all those speeches and
All his
write
speeches.
them. I know, and then quote them in the exam. And if you don't pass this exam, you cannot pass your baccalaureate, no matter how well you do, and then you can't get to uni.
Wow.
So I still remember when I just I was 17, it was a few days before my baccalaureate exam. Suddenly, my parents realized that I actually took a stapler and I stapled and blocked all the pages of that course that contained the speeches of Hafiz Assad. And my mom just went ballistic. My sister just reminded me of this when I was last in Syria. She was like, Reem, if you don't pass this, you're not going to go to the uni. And she was holding a scissor, undoing all the pages. And I was standing there like immature, defiant teenager saying, I'm not going to let this dictator, I'm not going to learn the words of this dictator. I'm not going to let him impose himself inside my head. But then I had to go to the exam, and I did sit the exam, and I did pass because I filled my paper with confetti of quotations of Hafiz Assad, which I made up, completely made up myself.
Really? And you were not failed?
No, because how are they going to find out? There's no Google, nothing. I just say Hafiz said this, he said that, and you kind of know how to phrase things to sound like him, and I passed this. The other way they kind of try to control is to rewrite our history, right? So not only to justify their presence, but also, for example, like the history of our struggle against the French colonialism was reduced to an armed struggle. Whereas all the activities of the Syrian political parties, the civil society, the struggle for constitution, completely written out of history. So the message to people was that if you want to change, it's only through armed struggle,
Violence.
and we are the ones who control the security apparatus in the country. So you have no way. So they wrote out our civic history. And the third arm, of course, was controlling the production of art. There was a strong machine controlling every artistic product. There is one state TV, always broadcasting all day entertainment and news, which was really propaganda. But I think the most dangerous use of art they did is this paradoxical use when they allow certain products, let's say theater or TV, that sound very critical on the surface, sounds very rebellious, but actually it acts in their favor. And it's usually the type of products that talks about the suffering, makes you laugh about it or cry about it as an audience. So it allows you to vent out, but it doesn't direct you towards action. You laugh about it and you think, oh, I'm now complicit in the resistance against the regime because I'm here sitting in a play that is critical and I'm laughing. But you go back home with the message that, but there isn't anything I can do. I just have to live this reality as it is. So when art really has to be um, a rehearsal for the change that we want, it was confined to be just a mirror of the reality and venting out uh, arena. Can I give you actually a living example? Because you asked me
Please.
how is it like today. So there was this very, very popular play when I grew up in Syria. It came out in 76. It's called Exile. It was played all over Syria, all over state TV. It became famous across the whole Arab world. And on the surface, it looks very critical. And you would think, oh my God, that is a very liberal regime that allows such play to be played. The play was about a rural village called Exile that is ruled by an autocratic mayor who applied all the tools of dictators, divide and rule, oppression, all of that. And then he imposed his own constitution on the people of the village, very repressive top down constitution. One day, a school teacher, enlightened school teacher, arrives to this village and he tries to mobilize people to stand against this autocratic mayor. And one day, when the mayor is present in the square of the village, he challenges him and say, "How? Who imposed you on those people? Who gave you the right to really impose these hefty taxes on the harvest of these poor farmers?" And the mayor says, "Well, it's all written in the constitution." I said, "Which constitution?" So I'm going to show you. We have a constitution. So he turns to his guards and say, "Can you bring me the constitution?" And they say, "Oh, well, sir, the constitution, you know the donkey of the village? The donkey ate the constitution." So the guy, so the guy there said, "Okay, well, the constitution was eaten by the donkey." Now that phrase, the constitution was eaten by the donkey, which eventually normalized distancing ourselves from the most important text in the state, where all the rules are set. That phrase continued to be part of our life until today, and it continues to normalize that distancing, that feeling that politics is absurd and there's no point to engage, there's no point to ask about constitutions. Like until recently, I've been talking to lawyer activists on the ground, asking them, "What happened to the constitution?" And it was like, "Oh, Reem, come on. The constitution was eaten by the donkey." So that's is 50 years on. So I think with the social media, with the satellites, which became very popular in Syria, that kind of monopoly over the art production, the drama, the cinema kind of started collapsing. People started seeing different products, different messages, started watching international media, and that kind of shook the scene. It ended the monopoly over creating the narrative. And that probably contributed, to all the other factors in stimulating the Arab Spring. What's happening today? It's deja vu. I think the new regime playing all the games again. The first thing they tried to do when they took over is to change the curriculum and rewrite history.
So I think when we release this episode of the podcast, we will tag it as the Constitution has been eaten by the donkey. I love it. I think a lot of people will be attracted to just find out what this means. So I think it'll be nice because people listening to this, including myself, by the way. One of the questions we have is Assad and his family always appeared invincible, and then things fell, and the regime that's replaced it has lots of contradictions, and same of the a lot of this same old kind of thing. But people are wondering, where exactly is Assad right now? What's his situation? Is there any public reporting on where this family that amassed so much of wealth at the expense of the people and so on? I believe they're somewhere in Russia, but maybe you can just give a brief update to people who are interested. Where are the Assads from all that power, and where are they now?
I know as much as you do. Like just what the media says, that they are properly in Russia, sitting in a very rich apartment, watching what's happening. And we heard some news that he has severe mental health issues, and it's all rumors. There is nothing concrete that we know, and people stopped caring. To be honest, they stopped caring. There's a new era. Uh, the regime was gone. It eroded from inside. Its internal sources of legitimacy were eroding, where even its own previous supporters were not fighting for it. The international support fell down, and it's gone. But not the games of the regime. They're still being played by a different regime.
Okay, that's so interesting. Thank you for that. Now you open the door to the next question, which is how the Assad regime used arts and culture to advance the authoritarian rule. And as one of the things I have been learning much later than you is the power of arts and culture. And as you know, we've been building this global movement called the Energizing Artivism Movement, which said that harnessing the power of arts and culture on its own will not deliver us salvation from the climate crises and the intersecting crises. However, failing to harness the power of arts and culture will almost guarantee that we fail. Now, you have been, um, as in your volunteer activism, has been focused on a media initiative to address this, the ideological state apparatus, if you want, and to make sure that people know what's happening, understand the urgency of the movement. Please take us into this institution that you've been part of, what's its work about, and your broader reflections of the power of arts and culture in the context of the Arab region.
Thank you, Kumi. Before going into that particular period, if you don't mind, I would like to speak about how I initially realized that the power and culture is so influential in our life and it's important tool of the messaging. And that was really during much earlier period in my life, around 9/11, actually. So when 9/11 took place, I was sitting in my office in Sweden researching the black holes, and suddenly the news broke about this horrific attack. And a concerned Italian friend of mine called me and said, Reem, please go back home and keep a low profile for the coming few days. And I was like, oh, but what did I do? And suddenly I realized that the Islamic part of my identity is now coming to the fore. I'm going to be seen as an Arab Muslim who had to be attacked. And indeed, back then, there was this huge rise in the number of Islamophobic attacks all across the world. I mean, in the US, it was 17 times fold. Um, so I tried to research what are the roots of this Islamophobic attitude, how did it develop? And I came to the conclusion that part of it comes from the way we answer the question, who do we owe in the modern world right now? Who do we owe for all the advancements in science and technology that we all enjoy? The answer to this question, as it was taught in the West, in schools and university and the media, is very, very Eurocentric. It all started in Greece at some point, and somehow all humanity went to a complete halt until Europe rose in the Renaissance and then through the scientific revolution and brought us everything else. And every other contribution is forgotten. And if it's brought to the story, it's brought as an isolated curiosity that happened somewhere else, not a part of a continuous journey. So that really, this is where I started cultural activism, and I tried to use art and media in that sense. And if you remember back then, actually the whole scene was influenced by the narrative of the Clash of Civilizations of
Yes.
Huntington, and it was used to just to understand how powerful it was. It was used heavily in Washington to really give a cultural legitimacy to the invasion of Iraq. Everything was framed as versus Islam, the West versus civilization versus Islam, and there's a clash of civilization. But I was like, well, if they are civilized, they wouldn't clash, right? So, I mean, so I tried to dig into it, and I kind of discovered how much the Arab Muslim civilization contributed to the making of knowledge. And here, when I say Arab Muslim civilization, I mean particularly what we refer to as the golden era of Arab Muslim science between 8th to the 14th century, roughly. It wasn't particularly about religion. It was a period where people from all different religions, all different ethnicity, gathered under the umbrella of the Islamic Empire, exercising different schools of thoughts, some inspired by the Muslim philosophies, huge influence by the Greek, by the Indians, by the Persian, but then they produced immensely intensive body of knowledge, art, and culture, which we continue to benefit from today. And that fit directly into the Renaissance. So I then started becoming very active using the story, going everywhere in the media, school workshops, talks, talking about this as a way to counter that narrative. And then, but everything I did until then was really not original. I was just repeating what other scholars discovered.
Reem,
And then in
Reem,
2000, yeah, yeah,
I know you're about to move to the next phase. If you can just hold that thought, This is really fascinating. But I just wanted to just share with, respond to two things that you've said, right?
Yeah.
One is what I would call the subtle demonization of Arab identity. Okay. And so I had an American friend explain this to me when I was a visiting scholar at Yale University in my when I was in my exile years, about how the whole media environment in the US is very subtly creating the Arab world as a demon and so on. And I said, how? He said, it's all over television. I said, what do you mean it's all over television? And then I'm embarrassed to say that I then got convinced that I needed to watch two American soapies. Okay. One was called Days of Our Lives, the other was called Bold and the Beautiful, right? You might think these are very innocent kind of just episodes. But when I looked at a couple of episodes, you could see the characters that were the worst characters would be somebody in the Arab world who's captured somebody, you know, who he was in a relationship with and stole the child or whatever it is. And and so I would say that there's a very interesting moment we're in, even in the United States, because in 2014, when opinion polls were done with, say, within the Democratic Party voters about where their sympathies were versus Palestinian freedom versus Israeli concern, it was about 14 points in favor of more American Democrats were concerned about, were more committed to, you know, Israel's interests. That study was just done again a month ago. And now, the answer to the same question is that there was a almost 40% swing, right? Where now close to 30% of Democratic Party voters, and by the way, a majority of Republican Party voters who say they are more concerned about the genocide, the killing of children, the starving of people, and so on. So sometimes, however the ideological machinery can be, the actions of the people on the ground actually, you know, forces people to see the light, or eventually people say that can't be right. And then just quickly, the question of the word civilization, right?
Yeah.
uh, I think is one of the most abused words in the history of language, right? Certainly in the English language, right? And
Yeah.
that, you know, one of the questions that I got asked recently by a young activist in Africa, from West Africa, he said, you know, I noticed that you worked for Greenpeace and Amnesty International, two institutions that have the genesis in the global north, you know. And then he asked me this question, which, you know, I think is a question that's worth putting out there, especially for our brothers and sisters in the global north. Because if you think about it, institutions like Greenpeace and Amnesty are almost amongst the best of what those societies offer in terms of global solidarity and support and justice and human rights and so on. But this young man asked me, he said, well, why do you think those parts of the world that gave us slavery, colonialism, fossil fuel dependency, militarization in the military industrial complex, um, torture, advanced torture techniques, and so on. Why do you think those parts of the world that gave us nuclear weapons and everything that we're struggling with, right, comes from there? Why do you think that those parts of the world, just because they self-describe themselves as civilized, that they should, be the ones? And so, one of the things in my work right now is really trying to redefine and celebrate indigenous knowledge, indigenous culture, and here's the beauty of the moment that we're in, even though it's a very frightening moment. that not colonialism's power, militarized capability, and so on, they've not succeeded in wiping out the cultures of the people in the Amazon, the people in various uh, Arab villages, people in the Pacific Islands, and so on. So the project of trying to colonize culture and make culture something has failed, thankfully. And you are in this current moment in the climate crisis, seeing a re-emergence of ancient knowledge, wisdom, and so on. So as you continue your journey into culture, I would just like you to very quickly, and this might be not a fair question to put you on the spot, if you were to say, what are the three or four or five major contributions that the Arab world made to the rest of the world, what would it be? And I stand to be corrected, but I believe even in math, they gave us one of the most important innovations in the form of the zero and so on. So, is there things that people might not be aware of the contributions of the Arab world? Because sadly, because of the collusion also of the Western media, right, and the bad and unfair way in which they've reported in the genocide in uh, Gaza, kind of creates the impression that this is a part of the world where, like, nothing good is coming when we know that is not the case.
Kumi, I'm not going to mention five things. I'll mention just one. They gave us the scientific methods, and that's enough. That is by far the biggest contribution. They made everything science. They introduced reason, testing theories, collecting data, making sure that every science is falsifiable. They turned everything into science. So they inherited, for example, from Greek astronomy as part of astrology. Astrology and astronomy were one and the same thing, and they said astrology is nonsense, and here's the science. They kept only the scientific part of it. Think of social science and how Ibn Khaldun also established as a social science. So to me, that's by far the most important contribution. And just to reflect on the issue of framing, okay, the framing of the Arab and Muslim. I'm going to tell you of an exception to that framing, which really the thing that struck me, and I started a whole kind of strand of activism around it, which is when I was researching all this Arabic history science, I stumbled over a body of evidence in the Royal Society in London, like concrete evidence, lots of documents and books and stuff. And the Royal Society is really the home of the scientific revolution. It's the oldest continuously functioning scientific institution that was established by Boyle and Newton and Hyde, all those big names, in science. And what were these scientists, the fathers of the scientific revolution, what were they doing in the 17th century? They were learning Arabic, doing everything they can to go and collect Arabic books and manuscripts from the Arab world for any price, and translating from Arabic to Latin or English, and then using this knowledge directly in the making of modern science. And this is a story hardly told. And that was like my new story, my new contribution. And what struck me is the use of art in that story. So all these scientists, you open their books, yeah, they say a book in astronomy, for example, and what do you find in the front page? A massive drawing of Arab Muslim scholars
Mhm.
with big gratitude. You open a book of medicine and you find Ibn Sina on the front page with his name in Arabic. That was printed in 17th and 18th century. You
Wow.
find Al Hazan, and they were glorifying them with sketches, with engravings, putting them as really, really high up. The way they framed them, they obviously were at the awe of these very, very big names who lived centuries and centuries before them. So that was a period when the framing was completely different because these are people who realized the importance of that knowledge produced by those scholars and how it contributed to their own knowledge. So they glorified them. And my conclusion was really When we learn from civilization, when we feel it's an active seat of knowledge, we do respect it. We don't clash with it. So I took all that, evidence, that's beautiful evidence, all these books and drawings, star catalogs, lots of books were like translated, were published both in Arabic and English together. And I just made a whole exhibition out of it to tell the story of how the science that is relevant to our day today, not in the past, had roots were very much mixed, very much international,
Mhm.
and that everyone contributed to it with a concrete evidence. Not just like during the Renaissance, there were lots of speculations about how every culture contributed, but during that period, it was concrete. Like I had handwritings in Arabic by Boyle, the founder of chemistry, for example, and
Wow.
the impact of that was really really big. So I was like, started organizing exhibitions around the world in London and Doha. I started writing a book about it. Then the Syrian revolution happened, and I paused everything. But what I took with me really is that beautiful use of art to acknowledge uh, those contributions. So can I go back now to your original question about how we
Yes, but
use it in the
okay. So I'm gonna just be delay you for one more minute, and
yeah.
that is, I'm gonna take what you said, and I was trying to say, how can we understand this ingenuity and innovation of science that comes so strong in the Arab world historically, and how does it play to humanity's concerns today, right? And I thought of how can we make that people centric, right? What does it mean at a time when the United States government is undermining science left, right, and center, whether it's on vaccines and so on. And the two simple things that I want to flag and just wanting you to confirm whether my understanding is correct. So if we take the issue of water and air conditioning, right? I have been reading up recently that actually in because of the scientific kind of approach to how do you live in harsh environments and so on, that historically there are, and now they're being revived, I understand, is traditional air conditioning just by how you think innovatively about architecture. And the second thing is, how do you have water systems built, right, in places with very limited water? And all of these innovations drawing on science actually made life survivable and thrivable and so on. Am I in the right reading of that? And would you like to just elaborate on that and then immediately jump into continuing the answer before I take us off in another direction again?
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, like the architecture that developed in the Arab Muslim world back then, it was developed to live with the environment, to harvest the wind through specially designed channels and cool the houses. So the houses were remained cool inside despite the heat outside. They used various techniques in harvesting the water, storing the water, all of that. And they built on also the knowledge of the Romans on this issue. So this it's really important always to stress that no one started from scratch. We were
Correct.
just handing the torch to each other, and to understand that we all owe humanity all different phases of our histories. I mean, civilizations go up and down, but we owe
Sure.
them all. A big thank you for everything they contributed.
Okay. So, and then how your next step in your cultural and arts journey?
So, my early support to the Syrian revolution really meant because I was just so loud all over international media, bashing the regime, international platforms in the UN and so forth. So that granted me a arrest warrant in Syria, and it meant I can't be there on the ground, active with everyone. And I wanted a way to access people, to pass the message, and to take all the products of our research and activism to a wider level. And this is where I realized that it's so important to use media, art, and culture in accessing people and spreading the message, and to present it not in the kind of normative, unrelatable way. You know, like for example, if we're talking about women rights, if you talk to people about, gender-based violence, intersectionality, I mean, some activists will tune in, but most people will just switch off. So we wanted to find a relatable way of telling the story and spreading it across all the divides, because we had a very divided scene in Syria. I mean, you're in the middle of a conflict, and the challenge was, how can we reach everyone? We don't want to end up talking to our own people. We want to promote the civic values we're fighting for, but not just talking to our friends and the people who are like us. So I teamed with some friends to establish a new media platform to deliver this message. And the first thing we realized, that we have to get out of our comfort zone and tap into the learning out of behavioral science and neurology to really understand how people behave, how do they make decisions, how do they form habits, so that we frame our message rightly, and it kind of spread across all the different divides. So the first thing we thought, okay, if you don't want to talk to the people that are already with us, the most strategic way is, I mean, first of all, we started with the research, understanding all the audience, the segments, and all of that, and we realized that there's a very big bulk in the middle. So typically, like populists, they start talking to the people who are like them, and then they amplify the message, and that only leads to increased polarization, as we know. But that also has its limits. You stop there, you can't reach other people. So we started reaching out to the people in the middle and producing content that is mixed. Some of it is very entertaining, the type that can really spread very quickly, very light songs, drama, films. And part of it is very informative. And we try to reach all those people who are not decided. They're not here nor there. Now, we gained them as followers, we gained their trust, and then gradually started introducing content that infuses civic values, talk about rights and issues and why you have to stand up to authorities and so forth. And from that, from this transformative audience, we kind of started spreading both directions to other type of audience, people who are with us or even against us. And we found that's very powerful, but again, we really had to break lots of stereotypes about how we reach people, understanding all that learn. I mean, we of course we realized that the people in marketing are far ahead of us in tapping into behavioral science and understand how we think, how we understand messages, and playing this to, you know, buy products and just consume things in an endless way. So we have to use the same insight, but to get people to relate to our message using cultural cues and history, storytelling, entertainment, uh, but also get a message for action.
That's great. And tell us about the institution a little bit more before we begin to wrap up. So uh, they work across the region, geographically, where the focus is. What kind of outputs is it? You said big drama and any other art forms?
Sure. So the platform is called One Plus One. It produces content in Arabic, so it's getting consumed across the Arab world. It's not just for Syria, and it tries to promote all the civic values we fight for, and also mental health issues. We realized there was a huge gap that we had to fill through different ways, with content that is either informative, just telling you all the basics about, let's say, post-traumatic stress disorder, how to deal with it, what it is, the symptoms, but also very entertaining content to show you how others are dealing with this issue and what can you do yourself. So we had lots of films, many of them won international prizes. We had songs, comedy. I mean, all sorts of kind of diverse. We had to diversify the content and understand how we can use algorithms so that people, just as they finish something that sounds very entertaining, we immediately bombard them with a message for action. And we tried to fill all the gaps. For example, let's take the issue of constitutions I spoke about. So to counter that, what the Assad regime created, we created different sets of contents, some to let people relate again to the Constitution, let them understand why it's so important that they really take part, that they should care, they should ask what's in the Constitution and why, how it's written. But also, we created very entertaining content that took the story of our constitutional fathers who tried several times through our history to write the constitution for Syria, despite the French, in a very legitimate, inclusive way with beautiful stories, amazing debates, inspiring personalities. So we put the story in a very entertaining content for them so that they relate and they understand that throughout our history, we had a different way to engage with the Constitution than just saying it was eaten by the donkey.
Okay, I'm still smiling at this phrase. I didn't hear it before, eaten as by the donkey. So, Reem, I'm surprised that we're almost at the end of our time. So, I want to, in the spirit of all that you've said, end on a cultural and artistic note of inviting you to share um, a song that you that speaks to you. Maybe you can introduce the song and then we'll play it. So over to you. Oh, you'll sing it. So over to you.
So the song I'm choosing is a 105-year-old Iraqi song called Shal Shal. And the opening line of this song goes, the pomegranate is weighing heavily on me. And then the lemon came to the rescue. But I don't want this good looking one. All what I want is my own people. So at face value, these lyrics make no sense at all, right? But hidden within them is a very coded political message. The pomegranate here symbolizes the Ottoman Empire through the red color of the fez, and the lemon symbolizes the Brits, the British, through the hint to the pale color of the skin and the blondness. The song was written in 1920 Iraq. Back then, the Ottoman Empire, after centuries of ruling over Iraq, was collapsing, leaving a lot of chaos and suffering behind. And into this vacuum, the British colonial power arrived, posing itself as the savior. And thus the line, the lemon came to the rescue. But the song makes it clear Iraq does not want to replace one foreign rule with another. All what it wants is to be governed by its own people. And indeed, in 1920, an armed revolution started against the British mandate and it spread throughout the towns and villages of Iraq, together with lots of similar songs with very coded message. And no one ever claimed the authorship of this song, which
Uh-huh.
continue to be very popular until today, which really conveys the nature of activism during turbulent time. It had to be anonymous,
Yes.
coded, and safe to share. And the use of coded message here served another purpose. It created the sense of solidarity among the community that there are local meanings that only we understand, like those foreigners will never grasp. And if you think also about the framing, Kumi, like throughout the song never talks about the mighty power, destructive power of the British colonial power. It doesn't.
Yes.
Because that would have played to the British narrative of superiority, right? Instead, it deflates the entire British Empire to a lemon, a mere lemon. Yeah? But probably the most striking thing is the next line that comes after that, because then the song goes straight away to address mothers. And it tells mothers not to wait. It says it's going to be a long wait, it's going to be a long struggle. And then It gives a collective trauma therapy advice to grieving mothers.
Uh-huh.
So it asks grieving mothers to go in groups to the shrine of a known Iraqi spiritual figure, and once at the shrine, to unlock their chest and let their sorrow and pain gush out.
Oh, wow.
So, I mean, I find just this absolutely striking that more than 100 years ago,
Yes.
they managed to infuse this psychological support message in a political song, carrying the sense that resistance is not just about defying the oppressor, but also about supporting the community. It's about helping the mothers bear the unbearable. And it just shows how art can carry activism way beyond politics, and goes straight to the heart where resilience and hope take root.
Thank you so much for your work, for your courage, for staying the course, and for sharing your knowledge in the way that you've done. And is the organization called One to One?
No,
The
one plus one.
oh,
That's
sorry.
the name of the platform. It's one plus one dot show.
And I wish you well in the work of One Plus One. I hope One Plus One will be part of the global artivism movement, which is growing in strength and so on. And I wish you well in your work. And I hope that in the changed circumstances, you will have more chances to go back home safely, though it's clear that there's no guarantee of that. So, but I hope I spent a very brief time in exile, 3 years when I fled as a 22-year-old. And I know that pain of not being able to be home. So I just want to offer solidarity on that. So thank you, thank you, thank you so much. So, folks, I hope you enjoyed listening to this amazing conversation with Reem Turkmani. If you found it of value, please share, subscribe, like, and please put your comments as well in the chat. And also, I want to invite people to recommend guests in those comments that you would like to hear from. So, wishing you well in wherever you find yourself. And remember, in the moment of history that we find ourselves in, pessimism is a luxury we simply cannot afford. Thank you for listening. Thank you, Rim, for your participation, and good luck with all your work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kumi. Thank you for hosting me. I so much enjoyed this conversation. We could have gone on for hours.
I
Thank
was,
you for continuing. Just thank you for being just such an inspirational figure to all of us and for all the good work that you do. A lot of gratitude. Thank you.
thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.